Hi, my name is Caleb, and this is my final presentation for COM 293 Intercultural Communications, presenting on my essay entitled Intercultural Identification and Relationships Within the Deaf Community. I do apologize if I'm a little bit hoarse or I start to cough. I'm sick right now, I have a cold, so I do apologize for that up front. Alright, so let's dive into this. My essay is looking at the deaf community, essentially. Um, and who they are. And they're a group of people that they're just like everybody else. You know, they live in our world. Um, Oftentimes, you really don't even notice a deaf individual unless you're kind of familiar with uh, how they kind of operate within this hearing world. You know, they drive, they shop, they raise families just like us. And the only real difference is that they can't hear. Some other major things are that as a community, the deaf lack a dedicated area, a dedicated state, or a city for them to be an established community in. They do, however, have one dedicated university in the world, and that's Gallaudet University, one school where it is built exclusively for the deaf community. And it's the simple fact that those in the deaf community live in a world that's not designed for them. You know, they live in a world designed for hearing people. So we're going to discuss a couple major points. We're going to discuss the differences in relationships between deaf individuals and deaf and hearing individuals. We're going to look at growing up as a coda and looking at being raised by hearing parents, so hearing parents raising a deaf child. We're going to look at a struggle for cultural identity within the deaf community, and then we'll wrap up with the deaf church in America. So as we begin to look at differences in relationships, that's our first point. The major barrier in relationships is communication. You know, if there's weak communication or if it's non-existent, obviously those relationships aren't going to work out because communication is critical for relationships. And especially when looking at a deaf individual and a hearing individual trying to establish a relationship of some kind, being able to cross that bridge, whether it be ASL or a hearing aid or an implant for a deaf individual, that barrier needs to be bridged. And there are, however, some commonalities just in human existence, things like body language, general hand movements, and facial expressions that help communication. Now, I had an opportunity to talk to my friend Matt Gurka, who's a deaf individual at UVF, and talk to him about his experiences being deaf and being raised by hearing parents. We talked about relationships, and I asked, what's the main difference between when you establish a relationship with somebody else who's deaf or with someone who's hearing? And he talked to me a little bit, and eventually we came down to he prefers having relationships with hearing people because there is this culture of gossip that's really heavy in the deaf community, and it's something that he really dislikes, and he prefers to have relationship with hearing people because he doesn't have that issue as much when you get that kind of cross-cultural relationship. We then talked about how his relationship with his parents was and what it was like growing up as a deaf child with hearing parents. And, as you would expect, communication was obviously very difficult between him and his parents. In fact, they started communicating by using kind of this self-developed sign language that he called home sign. And even then, especially with his father, it was difficult because his father felt silly using this home sign, and he had a major struggle learning ASL. So it was difficult to have that kind of father-son relationship that's common in cultures. And I asked Matt, I said, if you could give us one thing about, people in the deaf community, what do we need to know? And he said, the main thing is that deaf people aren't dumb. Like, they're the same as anybody in the hearing community. They just can't hear. That's it. They can do everything else that we can. So I had a chance then to talk to another friend of mine at UVF named Christine, uh, who's a coda. She's a child of a deaf adult. And what was interesting is that her experience was radically different from Matt's. We see that uh, being a coda is a lot easier because as a child of deaf adults, your first language is ASL, so communication isn't a major issue. In fact, sometimes babies develop ASL a lot faster. They can develop kind of oral skills and speaking. She also kind of elaborated on some little benefits of being a child of deaf adults. Things like you can stay up late and you're not going to get caught, and you can always listen to loud music. And I had an opportunity then to talk to my high school ASL teacher, who's Mrs. Jackie Sainer, an absolute saint of a woman. So she has a few children, and one of her sons was born deaf. And when he was born, she wasn't given proper information. Doctors were recommending to always push for oral training and hearing aids and implants. And eventually she found information on a deaf school and sent her son away to a deaf boarding school. And while that happened, she kind of she abandoned her life as like a stay-at-home mom, and she started to pursue a degree in ASL and deaf culture studies. And she did that to help not just communicate with her son, but she realized the need in our local deaf community that needed to be there to help. So she now teaches ASL in high school. She leads an ASL choir, and she's the host for our local deaf community Halloween party, where she brings together kids from her ASL classes and those in the deaf community to kind of bring everybody together and create an environment. So we're going to move on to a big point, and that's a struggle for cultural identity in the deaf community. This is a major issue, and it needs to be addressed. Things that are a major issue, one of them is that those in the deaf community don't have a unified location. They don't have a city, they don't have a state or even a country where they can all kind of gather and be together. One of the main issues with that is that obviously there are people like codas and families that have deaf children. So it's not something that is so common within families that a unified location would even be a viable option. They're kind of scattered throughout the world, so you end up with these kind of multiple smaller communities. And because of that, you also end up with so many different variations on their language. It's all basic, hand movements, very specific hand movements and facial structures and all kinds of stuff, but you still end up with vastly different variations. And when looking at the struggle for cultural identity, we can look at South Africa, which is a great example of historical discrimination, not only in race, but within the deaf community. People who were born deaf were actually seen as handicapped because being deaf was considered a deformity. And then they were separated away from other children, not only because they were deaf, but also by race. So you ended up with this kind of a fourfold split of white and black, but also white hearing, white deaf, and black hearing and black deaf. And this very small group of deaf black individuals were the only group of people that were establishing and maintaining South African Sign Language, which was really, really interesting. But there was that major struggle for a cultural identity because of this separation and the stigmas attached to being deaf in that culture. Now, in America, around the same time, deaf individuals were also kind of separated, and they were perceived as handicapped, and they were sent to schools for the deaf and the dumb. However, Gallaudet University was in its infancy in that point. It was starting to be, the idea was being born and established. It was founded by two individuals, Laurent Clerc and Thomas Gallaudet. And Lawrence Clerc was a deaf Frenchman, and he helped establish American Sign Language, which is why French and American Sign Language are very similar languages. The school was established in April of 1817, originally founded as the Connecticut Asylum at Hartford for the instruction of deaf and dumb persons. That is a school that later became Gallaudet University, and again, that's the only dedicated all-deaf university in the world. And that university was major in helping to establish a solid sense of cultural identity within the deaf community. Now, hearing people can attend Gallaudet, but all the classes, everything, all the instructional stuff is operated in ASL, and there are no spoken classes at that school. So looking at cultural and social identity in the deaf community, it's important that we establish what exactly a social identity is. And in a journal entitled Social Identity in Deaf Cultures, A Comparison of Ideologies, Deborah Maxwell McCaw writes the definition of social identity as an aspect of psychological functioning that is critical for a sense of well-being and positive personal development. It goes on, but that wraps it up pretty much. A social identity is imperative to having this positive personal development in people, and it's something that it is established in deaf communities, but it could be so much more than it is right now. And there are some major things that contribute in social identity, and those are shared experiences. And for the deaf culture, in shared experiences, you've got things like education with Gallaudet University. You've got shared experiences with language, which in America is ASL. You need to have an established culture as a shared experience, and that exists in our American deaf culture. And this leads to our final point, which is churches being a shared experience and the deaf churches in America. Talking about our final point, the deaf church. The deaf church is not one single established organization. Rather, it's many smaller churches of varying denominations kind of scattered throughout America within the larger pockets of deaf communities. And oftentimes, these communities are established and they meet at pre-existing churches kind of in the off hours. So they'll have their services later on a Sunday or on a Saturday where the main services, where they're not interrupting that. Talking about some early deaf churches, the first deaf church was actually established by Thomas Gallaudet's son, Reverend Thomas Gallaudet, named after his father, established in St. Anne's Church, or established in New York City, church named St. Anne's Church for the Deaf. It was established October 3rd, 1852, and that church is actually still operational as a subset of St. George's Episcopal Church, still in New York City. Another early church that was established for deaf individuals was Fulton Seamer's Memorial Christ United Methodist Church of the Deaf, and that was a church established in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1895, and that church also is still operational. Now, churches are an awesome place for a culture to come together and to establish themselves as a group. But when you look at how that group isn't just working inwardly at their own people, where they look outward, that's where we find groups like Deaf Missions. Deaf Missions is a missions group founded exclusively for the deaf community and deaf individuals, especially those seeking to pursue a degree in ministry. Deaf Missions was established in Iowa in 1970, and later the next year they were based out of Christ Church of the Deaf in Iowa. Now, Deaf Missions provides for the deaf community. They provide funding for deaf churches trying to plant. They provide funding for church camps established for deaf individuals, and they have scholarships and funding for higher education for deaf individuals who are pursuing degrees in ministry. Deaf Missions doesn't just focus on churches, they also provide a lot of funding for the development of deaf television. Things like the Finger Food Cafe, which is an adult program for deaf individuals. They also have established Big Bible Stories, which is a TV program for deaf children providing Bible stories in sign language. They're also responsible for the first translation of the Bible into ASL via things like YouTube and their website. And so they've actually recently completed the New Testament, and they're working on completing the Old Testament with a goal being 2020 as their finishing point to have the entire Bible completely translated into ASL via video services on the internet. In closing, we've looked at things like social identity and common spaces like Gallaudet University and churches that are absolutely critical for those in the deaf community. We've looked at interpersonal connections, things like building friendships. Find somebody in your local deaf community that you can build a friendship with. Establish a basic comprehension of ASL. Even just knowing letters is plenty to establish a friendship, and then you can move on from there and start to learn the language more fully. And the biggest part is just providing support for our deaf brothers and sisters. Thank you very much. This has been my presentation on intercultural identification and relationships within the deaf community. Thank you.